He came to the mountains to disappear. After his marriage ended and his military service was over, he wanted silence, nothing more. But on one winter night when the storm erased the road and the radio went dead, his dog stopped at the door, not afraid, listening. Someone was out there, alone, and running out of time. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Park City, Utah, wore January like a cast iron coat, beautiful from a distance, punishing up close. Snow didn't drift here so much as it accumulated with intent, stacking itself on rooftops and pine boughs until the whole town looked pressed into silence. The sky was the color of watered milk. Wind slid down the Wasatch like it had someplace urgent to be, slipping between buildings and under car doors, finding every seam. Even Main Street, postcard pretty in summer, felt narrowed by cold, its brick storefronts tucked behind curtains of frost, its hanging signs squeaking faintly when gusts caught them. Up on the ridgelines, the white was harsher, brighter, almost metallic. Locals called it clean. Rowan Cade Mercer called it honest. Cold didn't pretend to be anything else. Rowan had arrived in a borrowed pickup with a duffel bag and a dog that watched the world like it was a job description. The truck was an old Ford with heat that came and went, and a glove compartment that smelled like pine air freshener and someone else's cigarettes. He drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders squared out of habit, eyes forward and steady. At 41, he still looked built for carrying weight, 6 feet tall, broad through the chest and back, leaner than he used to be. His face had hard geometry, cheekbones that seemed cut with a blade, a jaw that held tension even when he was quiet, and a nose that had taken at least one break and healed slightly off-center. Dark hair, clipped short, had begun to show silver at the temples. A trimmed beard shadowed his mouth, not styled, just managed, like everything else about him. If you spoke to Rowan, you learned quickly he didn't waste words, not because he was rude, because he treated language the way he treated tools. Only pick it up when you mean to use it. His voice was low and roughened, the kind that sounded like it had spent years in wind. His eyes were a gray-green that rarely softened, not out of cruelty but out of practice. He learned how to look calm when his body was already calculating exits and angles and the distance between danger and the nearest cover. That training didn't drain away just because the army said he was done. The dog in the passenger seat was Sable, Belgian Malinois, a little over 7 years old, all muscle and quick intelligence, wrapped in a short fawn coat with a black mask that made his amber eyes look sharper than they already were. His ears stayed upright like antennae. His chest was deep, his legs long and springy, and his tail moved only when it had a reason. A black working harness lay across his shoulders, plain and functional, worn at the edges where a leash had clipped 1,000 times. The name tag on his collar was simple: Sable. No cute nickname, no phone number. Rowan didn't believe in decorating the truth. Sable had been trained for explosive detection overseas, the kind of partner you trusted more than your own instincts on bad days. He moved like a question mark turned into a weapon, always searching, always reading. He wasn't nervous. He was vigilant in the way only a dog with a past can be vigilant, calm on the surface, alive underneath. Rowan stopped in town long enough to do what needed doing, not sightseeing, not lingering. He parked outside a small grocery near the edge of Park City where snowbanks rose like walls and the parking lot had been scraped down to hard, salt-stained ice. Inside, the store was warm, crowded with tourists who smelled like expensive jackets and optimism. Rowan moved through them like a shadow with boots. He bought the basics: rice, canned soup, jerky, matches, coffee grounds, and a bag of dog food heavy enough to make his shoulder tighten. He didn't flinch. He just adjusted the strap and kept walking. At the counter, the cashier glanced up with a practiced smile that faltered when she met Rowan's eyes. She wasn't scared, just unsure where to place him. She looked late 20s, dark hair and a messy bun, cheeks flushed from heat and hurry. A name tag pinned to her sweater read, Kinsley. She took in his flannel jacket, his worn gloves, the dog waiting at the door outside because Sable did not like indoor spaces that weren't necessary, and she tilted her head as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Heading up to ski?" she asked, because in Park City that was the safe question, the question people expected. Rowan slid his card across the counter. "No," Kinsley blinked. "Just visiting?" Rowan's mouth tightened in something that wasn't quite a smile. Something like that. She rang him up, then leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice the way people did when they sensed something heavy and wanted to touch it gently. "Weather's mean today. They're warning about whiteout conditions up higher." Rowan nodded once. He always nodded once. "I heard." Kinsley hesitated, then tried again, reaching for humor like a small light. "Your dog looks like he could run the whole mountain if he wanted." Rowan glanced toward the door. Through the glass he could see Sable sitting perfectly still, facing the parking lot, eyes tracking movement the way a security camera might if it had a soul. "He thinks he already does." That got a real laugh from her, quick and bright. It surprised Rowan how it landed, like warmth against a place inside him that had been cold for a long time. He didn't chase it. He collected his bags, said, "Thank you," and left before the feeling could turn into anything else. Outside, the wind snapped the grocery's plastic banner against its pole. Sable rose immediately, stepping close to Rowan's leg, not pressing, just present. Rowan loaded the supplies into the truck bed, then rested his hand for a brief moment on Sable's head. The dog leaned into it, just enough to confirm he was there. The road out of town climbed fast, trading streetlights for trees, storefronts for dark slopes and long shadows. Pine forests thickened, the branches bending beneath the burden of snow. Higher up, the wind sharpened. The truck's tires hummed against packed powder. Rowan drove in silence with the heater struggling and his left knee beginning to ache in that deep, familiar way. An old injury that flared when cold set in, a souvenir from a blast that had thrown him hard enough to teach his bones a different language. He didn't talk about it. He didn't have to. Pain was just another weather pattern. Sable sat upright the entire time, nose angled toward the crack in the window Rowan kept open despite the cold. The dog's breathing changed now and then, slower, more focused, as if he was tasting the air for information. Every few miles he shifted his weight, ears flicking. Rowan noticed. He always noticed. In the army, the difference between a normal dog and an alert dog could mean the difference between walking forward and not walking again. The mountains rose around them like old stone guardians, indifferent and vast. Snowfields flashed between tree lines. A frozen creek cut through the valley below, dark and narrow as a scar. As the truck rounded a bend where the road narrowed and the drop-off steepened, Sable stiffened so abruptly it pulled Rowan's attention like a rope. "What is it?" Rowan murmured, not expecting an answer. Sable didn't look at him. His gaze pinned the forest, not at one spot, but at the space between spots, where movement could hide. A low sound gathered in his throat, not a growl, not a whine, something in between. Rowan's fingers tightened on the wheel. Then the radio went silent, not fading, not crackling, just gone. 1 second, a local station talking about lift tickets, the next second, a hollow hiss, then nothing. Rowan reached to tap the dial. The display flickered as if deciding whether it existed. The speakers stayed dead. A small, old instinct rose in him, sharp as a blade pulled from a sheath. Sudden silence. A dog reading the air. A road with no other vehicles. He felt that pre-detonation tension behind his ribs, irrational in a place that smelled of pine instead of diesel and dust. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Easy," he told Sable, but the word was as much for himself as for the dog. Sable didn't relax. He simply stayed focused, body angled forward like he was already moving in his mind. Rowan kept driving. He had come here because everything else had become a room with no oxygen. The divorce papers had arrived like an official stamp on what he already knew. He had turned into a man who vanished while still standing in the doorway. Lillian, tall, fine-boned, with pale skin that never tanned and light brown hair that always fell loose from her ponytail by noon, had loved him in the beginning with the fierce patience of someone who believed love could teach a man how to stay. Her eyes had been soft once, a blue-green that looked warmer than his ever did. Over the years, that softness had hardened, not into cruelty, but into exhaustion. When she finally left, she did it without yelling. Just one note on the kitchen counter and a key placed on top like a weight. I can't keep living with someone who's always halfway gone. Rowan hadn't torn the note. He hadn't chased her. He'd stood there in the empty kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum like the last living thing in the house. He'd learned in war that loud endings were a luxury. Some endings arrived quietly and still took everything. Now the mountains offered him the same kind of quiet, not the quiet of peace, the quiet of isolation, the kind he thought he deserved. The truck climbed higher. Snow began to fall in fine grains, not flakes, like the sky was sanding the world down. The road turned east toward a narrow pass where the trees thinned and the wind struck harder. A wooden sign, half buried in snow, announced the turnoff to an old service track. Rowan slowed, tires crunching. Sable's ears snapped forward so sharply it looked painful. Rowan took the turn. The service track was rough and narrow, cutting between drifts and boulders, climbing toward a ridge that vanished into cloud. The engine groaned. The world beyond the headlights felt endless and close at the same time. After a mile, the cabin appeared. Glass pass cabin, set back among pines, roof steep and dark, logs weathered but straight. It looked like it had been waiting, not decaying. No lights, no smoke, just the shape of shelter against the white. Rowan parked and killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed in immediately, heavy and complete. He sat for one heartbeat longer than necessary, hands resting on the wheel, breath fogging the windshield. He could hear Sable's breathing beside him, slow and controlled. Then the dog moved. Sable jumped down first, landing quietly on the snow, and circled the cabin in a wide, deliberate loop, nose low, reading the ground. He paused at the front steps. He did not climb them. He sat directly in front of the door, blocking it with his body, posture rigid but not afraid. Rowan stepped out, cold biting through his jeans. "You're kidding," he muttered, looking at the dark door as if it had personally offended the dog. Sable didn't glance back. His eyes stayed on the wood, the threshold, the seam where inside met out. Rowan approached, boots sinking, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't expected to feel here. Not danger, but recognition, like the cabin knew his name even if he didn't know its rules yet. He reached for the handle. Sable stayed planted. Rowan's hand closed around cold iron. And the chapter of his disappearance ended without fanfare, right there on a porch buried in snow, beside a dog who refused to let him walk into darkness alone. Rowan paused with his hand on the handle, feeling the iron bleed cold into his palm. The porch creaked beneath his boots, not the sharp complaint of rot, but the low settling sound of old wood adjusting its weight. Snow sifted down in fine grains, whispering against the logs. Sable remained seated in front of the door, shoulders squared, back straight, eyes fixed on the seam where the door met the frame. The dog's stillness wasn't fear. It was assessment. "All right," Rowan said quietly. "We'll do this slow." He opened the door. The cabin exhaled a breath of cold air that smelled faintly of pine resin and ash, the ghost of fires burned long ago. Inside, darkness pressed thick and complete for a moment before Rowan's eyes adjusted. The space was small but deliberate, thick log walls fit together with care, the seams packed tight. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, its chimney rising straight and true. A heavy wooden table sat near a narrow window, scarred by years of use but solid. Nothing felt abandoned, it felt paused. Rowan stepped fully inside, boots crunching softly on packed dirt and old planks. Only then did Sable rise and follow, crossing the threshold with a single, fluid motion. The dog stopped just inside the door, turning in a slow circle, nose working, cataloging the room the way Rowan used to clear buildings. Left corner, right corner, ceiling, exits. Sable's ears flicked once, then settled. He lay down near the door, not relaxed, but ready. Rowan closed the door behind them. The latch clicked home with a sound that landed somewhere deep in his chest. He hadn't realized how much of his life had been lived with doors half open until this one shut completely. He set his duffel on the table and shrugged off his jacket. The cabin held the cold stubbornly, but not viciously. It was the kind of cold that promised it could be pushed back with time and effort. Rowan struck a match, the sulfur sharp in his nose, and lit a lantern he found hanging by the hearth. Warm light spread slowly, revealing more details. Shelves lined with mason jars full of bent nails and twine, a narrow staircase climbing to a loft, and a rack of split firewood stacked with a precision that suggested habit rather than decoration. Someone had known how to prepare this place. Rowan crouched by the hearth and laid kindling the way his hands remembered. Small pieces first, air gaps left intentionally. He fed the fire carefully, coaxing rather than forcing. When the flames caught, they did so cleanly, the wood dry despite years of neglect. As the fire grew, the cabin responded. Logs expanded with a soft collective sound, not a groan but a settling, like an old animal stretching after a long sleep. He stood, rolling his shoulders, and for the first time since arriving on the mountain, something inside him loosened. Not relief, permission. Sable lifted his head at the sound of the fire, eyes tracking the movement of light on the walls. The dog's body remained coiled, his tail still. Rowan watched him for a moment, then looked away, giving the dog space to do his work. That was their rhythm, trust without commentary. Rowan moved through the cabin with measured steps, inventorying instinctively. Windows intact, no obvious drafts. Roof beams thick and well-angled. Whoever had built this place had understood winter not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a force to be endured. On the far wall, half hidden behind a shelf, he noticed shallow carvings in the wood, lines and symbols worn smooth by time. They weren't decorative. They were marks left by someone who had needed to remember something important. The staircase creaked lightly under his weight as he climbed to the loft. The space above was low-ceilinged but warm, the heat from the fire rising quickly. A narrow cot stood against the far wall, its blanket folded with a neatness that tightened Rowan's jaw. He ran his fingers over the fabric. No dust. Someone had been here more recently than the cabin's silence suggested. Below, Sable shifted and let out a quiet huff, not a warning, just acknowledgement. Rowan took it as permission to keep going. He descended and returned to the main room, where the fire had begun to throw real warmth. Rowan pulled food from his bag and set a pot of snow to melt. As he waited, he noticed a small radio on a shelf near the window, its casing yellowed, its antenna bent at an odd angle. He turned the dial experimentally. Static answered, thick and uneven, then faded back into silence. Rowan didn't push it. Some things came back when they were ready. Outside, the wind rose and fell like breathing. Snow tapped at the window in soft bursts. The world beyond the cabin felt close enough to press against the walls, but not close enough to enter. Sable's ears twitched whenever the gusts changed direction, his attention shifting in small, precise adjustments. Rowan ate standing at the table, dried meat and bread, simple and enough. He hadn't come here for comfort. He'd come here to stop pretending he needed it. When he finished, he poured water into a second bowl and set it near Sable. The dog drank, then resumed his watch. Time passed differently in the cabin. Minutes stretched. The fire settled into a steady burn. Rowan's knee ached, deep and dull, reminding him of a blast overseas that had thrown him against concrete hard enough to change the way his body moved through the world. He flexed it carefully and ignored the flare of pain. Pain was information. He'd learned how to listen without obeying. A knock came at the door. Not loud, not hesitant. 3 solid taps spaced evenly, as if the person on the other side understood the value of clarity. Sable was on his feet instantly, body aligned with the door, a low sound gathering in his chest. Rowan didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one close anyway. Instead, he stood slowly, boots silent on the floor, and approached the door from the side. "Who is it?" he called. "Jonah Pike," came the answer. The voice was male, older, steady. "Forest Service. I saw your smoke." Rowan opened the door just enough to see. Jonah Pike stood on the porch with snow dusting the shoulders of his heavy ranger coat. He was in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of leaning into wind had reshaped him. A full gray beard framed a mouth that looked more accustomed to squinting into weather than smiling at people. His eyes were a clear, sharp blue, observant without being intrusive. A knit cap sat low on his head, and his gloves were worn smooth at the fingertips. Sable stepped forward, sniffed Jonah's boots, then his gloves, and paused. After a moment, the dog stepped back, posture easing by a fraction. Jonah noticed and nodded once, a man acknowledging another professional. "Evening," Jonah said. "Road's going to be ugly tonight. Thought I'd check the cabin." Rowan opened the door fully. "It's standing." Jonah's gaze swept the interior, lingering on the fire, the stacked wood, the lantern. Something like recognition flickered across his face. "So it is," he said. "Name's Jonah. I keep an eye on this stretch when the weather turns mean." "Rowan," Rowan replied. "This is Sable." Jonah crouched with effort and held out a gloved hand, palm down, letting the dog decide. Sable sniffed, then leaned forward briefly, pressing his nose against the man's knuckles. Jonah smiled faintly. "Still choosing dogs first," he murmured, more to himself than to Rowan. Rowan caught the words but didn't comment. Jonah straightened and shifted his weight. "You planning on staying?" Rowan considered the question. "For now." Jonah nodded, accepting it without probing. "Storm's building faster than they predicted. Whiteout up high. If you hear anything on the radio, it'll be patchy." He paused, then added, "This place isn't on most maps. People forget it exists." Rowan looked around the cabin, at the walls that felt more present than forgotten. "Seems like it remembers itself." Jonah's mouth twitched. "That's one way to put it." He stepped back onto the porch. "I'll swing by after the storm breaks. If the light's on, I'll know you made it through." After Jonah left, the quiet settled again, altered by the knowledge that someone else knew Rowan was here. It didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a thread tied loosely to the outside world. Night deepened. The fire burned low and steady. Rowan climbed to the loft and lay on the cot, boots off, jacket folded within reach. Sleep came in fits, shallow and watchful. At some point near midnight, the wind shifted sharply, changing its tone against the walls. Sable's head snapped up below, a low sound rising from his chest, not alarm, but notice. Rowan sat up, heart steady. He listened. Something pressed against the air, subtle but insistent, like a question that hadn't been asked out loud yet. Rowan lay back slowly, one hand resting on the edge of the cot, grounding himself in the solid fact of the cabin beneath him. Whatever waited outside could wait a little longer. The mountain had allowed him inside. That felt like the beginning of something, whether he wanted it to be or not. Morning did not arrive so much as it filtered in, diluted and pale, as if the mountain were reluctant to disturb what had settled overnight. Rowan woke to the sound of wind moving through trees at different heights, a layered sound that carried direction poorly. He lay still for a moment on the narrow cot in the loft, eyes open, cataloging the noises the way his body remembered to do before his mind caught up. Below him, Sable was already awake. He could tell by the rhythm of the dog's breathing, slow, controlled, alert without tension. When Rowan climbed down the ladder, the fire had burned itself into a bed of red coals that still gave off heat. The cabin held warmth better than he'd expected. That alone told him something about the person who'd built it. You didn't get that kind of efficiency by accident. Outside, the world had been reshaped overnight. Snow lay in smooth, uninterrupted sheets, erasing tracks, softening edges. The sky was a flat, bright gray that made distance hard to judge. Rowan stepped onto the porch with a mug of bitter coffee warming his hands and felt the cold test him immediately, probing for weakness. It found his knee and settled there, dull and persistent. Sable moved past him, nose low, tracing the edge of the clearing. The Malinois' coat caught the light, short, dense, perfectly suited for work rather than display. At 7, Sable was past the age when young dogs burned energy for its own sake. Everything he did now had intention behind it. He paused at the eastern edge of the clearing and lifted his head, ears forward, body angled slightly uphill. Rowan followed his gaze. Nothing obvious moved among the trees. But the wind there sounded different, higher, thinner, as if it were slipping through a narrow throat of rock. "That's new," Rowan murmured. Sable didn't respond. He rarely did when the work mattered. By mid-morning, clouds thickened, their lower edges dragging against the ridgeline. Rowan spent the daylight hours reinforcing small things, clearing snow from the roofline, checking the seals around the windows, moving firewood closer to the door. His movements were economical, shaped by years of doing physical work with consequences. Every time he straightened too quickly, his knee reminded him of the blast that had ended one chapter of his life and refused to let him forget it. He was hauling another armload of wood when Sable cut sharply across his path and stopped, blocking him with his body. Rowan halted mid-step. A heartbeat later, the packed snow beneath where his foot would have landed cracked open, revealing a thin skin of ice over a hollow. Rowan stared down at it, then back at the dog. "All right," he said quietly. "Point taken." Sable stepped aside and resumed his circuit, tail still. There was no triumph in him, just confirmation. The wind shifted again near noon, and with it came a sound Rowan hadn't heard since overseas, footsteps that didn't belong to him, not close, not yet, measured, human. He straightened slowly, scanning the tree line. A figure emerged from the white, climbing steadily toward the cabin. She moved with practiced confidence, leaning slightly into the wind, boots finding purchase where the ground sloped treacherously. She wore a weatherproof parka the color of wet stone and a knit cap pulled low over dark hair that escaped in stubborn curls. A pack rode high on her shoulders, balanced and well-worn. Sable stiffened but did not bark. Rowan waited until she was close enough to see clearly. She was in her mid-30s, tall and straight-backed, with sharp cheekbones and skin weathered just enough to suggest she spent more time outside than inside. Her eyes were a clear hazel, assessing and unflinching, the kind that didn't look away first. When she stopped a few yards from the porch, she planted her poles and lifted her goggles. "Morning," she called, voice steady, carrying easily over the wind. "I'm not lost," Rowan almost smiled. "Almost." "Good," he said. "Most people who start by saying they aren't." She huffed a short laugh and stepped closer, careful not to crowd the dog. "Maeve Holloway, I run atmospheric monitoring for the county." She nodded toward the ridge. "I've got a station up there that's doing some strange things." Rowan glanced at Sable, who had shifted his stance to face her, ears high, posture alert but neutral. The dog took one step forward, sniffed the air around her boots, then looked back at Rowan. "Clear." "Rowan Mercer," Rowan said. "This is Sable." Maeve's gaze lingered on the dog with professional interest. "Belgian Malinois," she said. "Explains the look he's giving me, like he's already decided what I'm worth." Sable's tail flicked once. Maeve noticed and smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a pass." They stood for a moment, listening as a gust of wind tore through the trees above them, carrying snow sideways. Maeve's expression sharpened. "The wind corridor through this pass is bending sound and pressure more than it should. Instruments are lagging. Radios, too." She paused, studying the cabin. "Didn't expect to see smoke here." Rowan followed her look. "It's standing," Maeve nodded, filing that away. "There's a front moving faster than predicted. Whiteout conditions by nightfall. The kind that turns maps into suggestions." Rowan leaned against the porch rail, the wood solid under his weight. "That explains the radio." "That explains a lot," Maeve said. "This place sits in a convergence zone. Wind comes at it from 3 directions once the front hits. Makes everything unreliable." Sable lifted his head sharply at the word, as if it carried weight. Maeve noticed. "He hears it too," she said softly. Rowan studied her more closely now, the way she held herself, the absence of wasted movement. This was someone shaped by loss and discipline. People like that tended to recognize each other. "My brother," she added, unprompted, eyes still on the trees. 5 years ago, storm like this one. Search and rescue did what they could, but the mountain doesn't bargain." "I'm sorry," Rowan said. He meant it. Maeve nodded once. "Me too." She shook it off with a small, practiced motion. "I'm setting a temporary weather station closer to the pass. If you're staying, you should know what's coming." Rowan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cabin, at the way it sat against the mountain without apology. At Sable, who had already repositioned himself between the porch and the eastern approach. "I'm staying," Rowan said finally. Maeve met his eyes, something like approval flickering there. "Then you'll want this." She reached into her pack and pulled out a compact handheld radio, scuffed but sturdy. "Range isn't great in this terrain, but it's better than nothing." Rowan took it, weighing it in his hand. "Thank you." Don't thank me yet, Maeve said. You might need to use it. She turned to leave, then paused. If your dog starts acting like the mountain's talking to him, listen. Sable's ears twitched. Rowan watched her disappear back into the trees, moving uphill with the same steady confidence she'd arrived with. The clearing felt different after she left, not quieter, more attentive. The storm arrived in the late afternoon. Not all at once, but in layers. Wind first, probing, testing, then snow, thick and blinding, erasing the world beyond a few feet. Rowan kept the fire fed and the door sealed, his movements careful, deliberate. His knee protested every climb up the ladder to check the roof. He ignored it. Sable paced in short, efficient lines from door to window to hearth, performing an inventory only he could see. When Rowan stumbled descending the ladder, Sable was there instantly, shoulder braced against his leg, steadying him without ceremony. "I've got it," Rowan muttered. Sable huffed softly, unconvinced. By nightfall, the storm had found its full voice. The cabin shook under the pressure, logs groaning in protest but holding. Rowan sat at the table, both hands wrapped around a mug, listening to the wind attempt to argue with the walls. He felt small, not in fear, but in awareness. The mountain did not care who he had been or what he'd lost. It only asked whether he could endure. A sound cut through the storm, faint, irregular, almost lost beneath the wind. Sable froze, head snapping toward the eastern wall. His posture changed completely, muscles locking into readiness. Rowan's pulse quickened. He listened hard. There it was again, 3 short bursts. Not wind, not an animal. Human-made, human-paced. Rowan stood slowly. "I hear it," he said. Sable didn't move, eyes fixed on the door. Whatever was out there wasn't at the cabin yet, but it was close enough to matter. Rowan reached for his coat and gloves, the weight of decision settling on him with unexpected clarity. He hadn't come here to save anyone. He'd come here to disappear. But the mountain, it seemed, had other plans, and Sable had noticed long before he had. Outside, the storm howled, patient and relentless, as if daring him to answer. The sound came again, clearer this time, cutting through the storm in uneven pulses that no wind could imitate. Sable's body was a drawn bow, every muscle locked, his head angled slightly as if triangulating something only he could hear. Rowan stood with his coat half on, one glove dangling from his fingers, listening until the pattern settled in his bones. 3 beats. A pause. Then 2. Human cadence. Not random, not desperate yet, but close. Rowan finished pulling on his coat, the heavy fabric stiff with cold, and cinched it tight. His movements were steady, deliberate, the way they had been when he still wore a uniform and decisions carried weight beyond himself. He clipped the rope to Sable's harness, checked the knot twice, and rested his hand briefly on the dog's shoulders. The Malinois leaned into the touch for half a second, then faced the door again, ready. "East," Rowan said, not as a command but a confirmation. Sable did not look back. The door opened into a wall of white. Snow drove sideways, stinging exposed skin, swallowing the edges of the world. The porch vanished behind them within seconds as the storm erased all reference points. Rowan anchored himself by feel and memory, one hand wrapped around the rope, the other tucked close to his body. His knee protested immediately, a sharp flare that reminded him of concrete and fire, and the moment his life had split into before and after. He breathed through it and kept moving. The forest closed in, trees appearing and disappearing like figures in a bad dream. Sound bent and folded, coming from the wrong directions, arriving late. Rowan felt it tug at his balance, at his sense of space. This was what Maeve had warned him about. This was where maps lied. Sable led without hesitation. He cut diagonally across the slope, avoiding a shallow ravine hidden beneath drifted snow, stopping every few yards to reorient. His movements were precise, economical, guided by something deeper than sight. Rowan trusted it. He had learned long ago that there were moments when your job was not to understand, only to follow. They reached a cluster of fallen trees where the wind softened, blocked by tangled trunks and rock. Sable slowed, nose buried deep now, breath coming faster. He circled once, twice, then stopped abruptly and barked, one sharp sound, close and urgent. Rowan dropped to his knees and shoved snow aside with gloved hands. Beneath a fallen branch weighed down with ice was a shape that did not belong to the mountain. small. Curled inward, human. "It's all right," Rowan said, though the words were mostly for himself. "I've got you." The child was a girl, maybe 11, thin and bundled in a jacket that had not been built for this kind of cold. Dark hair clung to her forehead, stiff with ice. Her lips were tinged blue, her breathing shallow but present. Rowan worked quickly, clearing her airway, checking for a pulse at the neck, weak but steady. Alive. Sable approached slowly, his posture changing completely. He lowered himself beside the girl and nudged her gently with his nose, then pressed his body against her side, radiating heat. The dog's amber eyes softened, his movements careful, deliberate. "Stay with me," Rowan murmured, wrapping his coat around the girl's shoulders. "Just stay." Her eyelids fluttered. "Dad," she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. Rowan swallowed. "We're going to get you somewhere warm." The climb back to the cabin was brutal. Rowan carried the girl against his chest, every step in argument with gravity and pain. Sable stayed close, guiding, doubling back whenever Rowan's footing slipped, placing himself between Rowan and danger without needing to be told. By the time the cabin loomed out of the storm, Rowan's knee burned and his lungs felt scraped raw, but he did not slow. Inside, warmth hit them like a physical thing. Rowan laid the girl near the hearth, stripped away wet layers and wrapped her in blankets. He monitored her breathing, rewarming slowly, carefully. Sable lay beside her, body curved protectively, one paw resting against her arm. When she stirred again, her eyes opened briefly, unfocused. "You're safe," Rowan said. "My name's Rowan. This is Sable." The girl's fingers curled into the dog's fur. She did not let go. Hours passed before her breathing steadied and color returned faintly to her cheeks. Rowan sat back on his heels, exhaustion crashing into him all at once. He stood, forcing stiffness from his joints, and stepped outside briefly to mark the trail they had taken, driving a reflective stake into the snow where the forest swallowed direction. That was when Sable stiffened behind him. The dog's head snapped up, not toward the trees, but toward the ridge above the cabin. He let out a single sharp bark, higher than before. Rowan followed his gaze. Through thinning snow, he saw it, a small, unsteady light, wavering, then gone. Not lightning, not reflection, a signal. Rowan locked the door behind him and turned back to the fire. Whatever was out there was not finished yet. The girl woke fully near dawn. Her name was Tess Calder. She spoke softly, voice trembling but clear, explaining how the car had broken down, how her father had gone for help, how she had tried to follow footprints when fear made everything louder and closer at the same time. Rowan listened without interruption. Sable stayed at her side, chin resting near her knee. By mid-morning, engines cut through the quiet. 2 vehicles emerged along the narrow access road, a dark SUV and an older Forest Service truck painted dull green. Tess bolted upright at the sound. "Dad!" Her father burst through the door moments later, a tall man in his early 40s with a weather-beaten face and eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and guilt. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his daughter in his arms, holding her like she might vanish again if he loosened his grip. "I'm here," Tess said into his shoulder. "I'm okay." Rowan stepped back, giving them space. From the Forest Service truck, Jonah Pike emerged more slowly. He took in the scene, the fire, the blankets, the dog lying watchful at the door, with a long, steady look. When his gaze landed on Sable, something like recognition crossed his face. "Well," Jonah murmured, kneeling with effort and resting a hand briefly on the dog's neck. "I'll be damned." Maeve Holloway arrived shortly after, her parka dusted with snow, her expression tight with controlled relief. She checked Tess's vitals with practiced efficiency, then straightened and met Rowan's eyes. "You heard it," she said, "not a question." Rowan nodded. He did first. Maeve glanced at Sable, who sat calmly now, duty fulfilled for the moment. Of course he did. As the vehicles prepared to leave, Jonah lingered by the hearth, studying the carvings on the wall. "This cabin," he said quietly, "was never abandoned." Rowan looked up. "What do you mean?" Jonah traced a finger along one of the worn lines. "Your grandmother, Alowan Mercer. She built this place as a counterpoint, back when storms took people every winter. She studied wind patterns, marked danger zones, set this house where it could answer when someone was lost. Rowan felt the weight of it settle in his chest. The cabin wasn't a hiding place. It was a line drawn in the wilderness. Outside, the storm had eased, leaving behind a world rinsed clean and blindingly white. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. Rowan stood on the porch with Sable at his side, watching the vehicles disappear down the road. He had come here to disappear. The mountain had decided otherwise. The mountain loosened its grip slowly, like a hand that had clenched too long and was reluctant to admit it needed to rest. Morning arrived in thin layers of light, pale and reflective, turning the snow into a surface that hurt to look at directly. The storm had retreated uphill, leaving behind a silence that felt weighted rather than empty. Rowan stood on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling too quickly in the cold, watching the last of the Forest Service vehicles disappear down the access road. Their tracks cut clean lines through the snow, proof that what had happened the night before was not a dream shaped by exhaustion. Sable lay across the threshold behind him, massive paws braced against the wood, ears flicking at every distant sound. His posture had changed. He was no longer in crisis mode, but he wasn't resting either. He looked like a sentry who understood the difference between danger past and danger postponed. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wool, pine smoke, and the faint metallic tang of first aid supplies. Rowan moved slowly now, joints stiff, his knees swollen enough that he could feel the fabric of his jeans tighten when he bent. Pain had settled in properly, no longer sharp, just deep and insistent. He accepted it as the cost of what he had done. Some debts were immediate, others arrived later. He cleaned without thinking much about it, folding blankets, hanging wet clothing near the hearth, wiping melted snow from the floor. Routine steadied him. The table bore the marks of the night's urgency. A water ring from a mug, a smear of ash where Sable's tail had brushed against it. The handheld radio Maeve had given him sitting exactly where he'd set it down. He picked it up and turned the dial. Static answered, but beneath it he caught fragments, wind warnings, elevation numbers, a clipped male voice repeating coordinates. Rowan wrote them down on a scrap of paper without fully realizing he was doing it. When he finished, he noticed something he hadn't before. A low shelf built into the wall near the staircase, half hidden behind a rack of tools. It wasn't new. It was simply overlooked. On it sat a narrow wooden box, its surface darkened with age, the corners reinforced with iron that had been hammered flat by hand. The lid was carved with shallow lines that matched the markings Jonah had traced the night before. Rowan knelt, testing the weight before lifting it. The box was heavier than it looked. He carried it to the table and set it down carefully, like something that might object to being rushed. Sable rose and approached, sniffing the edges. His ears angled forward, not alert in the way he had been during the storm, but attentive, as if this thing mattered in a different way. He sat beside the table and waited. "All right," Rowan said quietly. "Let's see what you're so interested in." The lid resisted at first, then gave with a soft sound, releasing a faint smell of oilcloth and old paper. Inside, everything was arranged with meticulous care. Maps lay stacked and folded, their edges softened by years of handling. Some were standard topographic sheets, marked and remarked with pencil and ink. Others were hand-drawn, the lines confident, the annotations precise. Wind corridors were shaded, snow distortion zones were circled. Small symbols, triangles, slashes, arrows, recurred with deliberate consistency. Rowan felt something tighten behind his ribs. These weren't the notes of a hobbyist, they were operational. Beneath the maps lay a set of weather logs bound together with twine, each page dated and initialed in the same hand. Alain Mercer's handwriting was angular and efficient, the kind that wasted no space on sentiment. She had recorded wind shifts, pressure drops, sound anomalies. One entry caught Rowan's eye immediately. Glass pass bends direction after dusk. Sound arrives late from the east. Follow the dog, not the echo. Rowan exhaled slowly. At the bottom of the box was a folded envelope, thicker than the rest, addressed simply in pencil. R. Mercer. No return address, no date. Rowan did not open it yet. He sat back, letting the weight of what he was holding settle into him. The cabin hadn't just been built to endure winter, it had been built to interpret it, to translate the mountain's worst habits into something survivable. Behind him, Sable shifted and rested his chin on the edge of the table, eyes on the maps. Rowan glanced at him. "You recognize this," he said, not really a question. Sable's tail thumped once against the floor. Not excitement. Confirmation. The knock came mid-morning, brisk and unmistakably human. Rowan closed the box and slid it back onto the shelf before opening the door. Maeve Holloway stood on the porch, her dark hair pulled into a low braid that brushed the collar of her parka. Snow clung to the seams of her jacket and the cuffs of her gloves. She looked tired in the way people did after adrenaline had burned off, leaving only consequence behind. Her eyes flicked past Rowan into the cabin, cataloging without apology. "You're still standing," she said. "So is the cabin," Rowan replied. Maeve nodded. "That makes two of you." She glanced down at Sable, who had approached and now sat squarely between them. And him. "I came to check the station," she continued, "and to make sure you hadn't decided this was a one-time thing." Rowan studied her face, the lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of squinting into wind and sun, the set of her mouth that suggested she didn't waste energy pretending to be softer than she was. "I'm not sure what I've decided yet." Maeve accepted that. "Fair." She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. "Jonah's filing a report. Unofficial, but detailed. He doesn't like paperwork, but he likes winter deaths less." Rowan closed the door and leaned against it. "He said this place was never abandoned." Maeve's gaze shifted to the shelf, where the edge of the wooden box was just visible. "He's right," she said. "Your grandmother built this cabin because the data told her people were dying here in patterns no one wanted to admit. Before satellites, before reliable forecasts, she trusted observation and dogs." Sable's ears flicked at the last word. Maeve continued, "She trained dogs here, not formally, no program, just her and the mountain and a belief that some animals notice things before we do." Rowan felt the pieces align in his mind with a quiet finality. The carvings, the maps, Sable's instincts, the way the cabin had seemed to breathe when the fire caught. "I didn't know her," he said. "Not really." Maeve softened at that, just a little. Sometimes the people who build the most don't leave room to explain themselves. Rowan reached for the wooden box and opened it again, this time in front of her. Maeve leaned in, recognition lighting her features as she scanned the maps. "These wind corridors," she said, "they're accurate, more accurate than what we use now." She looked up at him. "This place could save lives." Rowan closed the box carefully. "It already has." Maeve didn't argue. By afternoon, word had begun to move, not loudly, but the way mountain news always did, through quiet calls and careful questions. A truck stopped at the edge of the clearing, its engine idling. The driver climbed out slowly, favoring one leg. His name was Eli Barnes, a man in his early 50s with a weather-beaten face and a beard gone more gray than brown. He was broad through the shoulders, built like someone who had spent his life lifting things that fought back. A logging accident years earlier had left him with a permanent hitch in his step and a cautious way of moving that came from learning the hard way how fast things could go wrong. "Jonah said you might need this," Eli said, gesturing to the truck bed, where extra fuel cans and a stack of split wood were secured. "Didn't ask questions." Rowan met his eyes. "Thank you." Eli nodded, satisfied. He glanced at Sable. "That dog yours?" "Yes." Eli smiled faintly. "Good dog." Sable acknowledged the assessment with a single dignified wag. As the day wore on, Rowan found himself doing something he hadn't planned on. Staying. Not just physically, but with intention. He reorganized the maps, marking recent changes. He tested the radio again and caught a clearer signal this time. He hung a lantern near the porch and trimmed the wick carefully, setting it where it would be visible from the slope below. At dusk, Maeve stood beside him on the porch, watching the light spill out into the growing dark. "If you leave it on," she said, "people will come." Rowan considered that. The old version of himself, the one who had learned to disappear quietly, bristled at the idea. The man standing there now, aching and tired and still breathing, felt something else entirely. "Then I'll be here," he said. Maeve studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll adjust the station to account for that." She left as night settled in, her figure swallowed by shadow and snow. Rowan stayed where he was, one hand resting on the porch rail, the other on Sable's head. The dog leaned into the touch, solid and present. Inside the cabin, the wooden box waited, its contents no longer hidden, no longer silent. Rowan knew he would open the letter soon. Not tonight. Tonight was for listening, to the wind, to the quiet, to the unfamiliar weight of responsibility that did not feel like a burden so much as an answer. The mountain had spoken, and this time, Rowan did not look away. Night did not fall all at once. It arrived in increments, shadows stretching longer between the trees, the cold sharpening its edges as if the mountain were paying closer attention now. Rowan stood on the porch longer than he needed to, watching the lantern he had hung sway slightly in the wind. The flame inside burned steady, protected by glass and metal, a small, stubborn circle of warmth refusing to be swallowed by the dark. He had not told himself why he left it on. He only knew that turning it off felt wrong. Behind him, Sable settled near the door, his body aligned with the opening, head up, eyes half-lidded but alert. The Malinois was 7 years old, his muzzle just beginning to show flecks of gray if the light hit it right. He carried himself with the assurance of a dog who had learned the cost of missing things. His coat was dense and short, built for speed and endurance rather than comfort, and the muscles along his shoulders shifted subtly every time the wind changed. He was not waiting. He was listening. Rowan closed the door and secured the latch, then leaned his weight against it for a moment. The ache in his knee had settled into a constant throb, no longer sharp enough to demand attention, just loud enough to refuse being ignored. He moved with care as he crossed the room, favoring the leg without thinking about it. Habit had shaped him more than he liked to admit. The cabin had changed since morning. Not physically, nothing had moved that mattered, but in presence. The maps on the table, the radio humming faintly between bursts of static, the lantern glowing outside like an invitation, none of them had spoken aloud. Rowan had spent the afternoon reinforcing small things, tightening a hinge, replacing a cracked pane with salvaged plexiglass from the shed down the ridge, stacking extra blankets by the hearth. None of it felt dramatic. All of it felt necessary. He poured water into the kettle and set it to heat, then sat at the table and unfolded one of Elowin's hand-drawn maps. He traced a wind corridor with his finger, comparing it to the notes he'd made earlier. The pattern was unmistakable now. The cabin sat just outside the worst of it, close enough to sense danger early, far enough to avoid being swallowed. It was not luck. It was design. Sable rose without sound and moved to the eastern window, nose close to the glass. His ears flicked once. Rowan followed his gaze, heart rate ticking up a fraction. At first, there was nothing. Just snow drifting lazily through the beam of the lantern. Then he saw it. A shape moving uphill, slow and uneven, stopping every few steps as if reconsidering the idea of forward motion. Rowan stood, chair legs scraping softly against the floor. He grabbed his coat and pulled it on, then paused. He did not reach for the rope this time. Whatever this was, it wasn't a storm-driven emergency. It was someone making a choice. He opened the door. Cold rushed in, sharp and immediate. The figure below the porch raised a hand, palm out, not in surrender but in acknowledgement. As the lantern light fell across her face, Rowan took in the details quickly, instinctively. She was a woman in her early 40s, tall and lean, with a posture that suggested years of moving under weight. Her parka was heavy-duty, scuffed and repaired in places, the kind chosen for function rather than appearance. Dark blonde hair shot through with gray was pulled into a low braid that brushed her shoulder. Her face was lined not by age but by endurance. Wind-burned cheeks, eyes steady and assessing, a mouth set in a way that suggested she had learned how to hold words back until they mattered. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked up at Rowan. "I was told the light meant I could stop," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something tired underneath it, something that had traveled a long way. Sable stepped forward and sat, positioning himself squarely between Rowan and the woman, head lifted, posture neutral but attentive. The woman noticed immediately. Her gaze softened. "Good dog," she said quietly. Sable accepted the judgment without ceremony. Rowan studied her for another moment. "You can come in," he said. "It's warm." She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for miles and climbed the steps carefully, favoring her left ankle just slightly. Inside, she removed her gloves and flexed her fingers near the fire, the tension easing out of her shoulders in small increments. "My name's June Hollis," she said. "I'm not lost. Not exactly." Rowan nodded. "Rowan Mercer." She glanced at Sable. "And I assume he's the one who decides whether that's true." "Usually," Rowan said. June's eyes flicked around the cabin, taking in the maps, the stacked supplies, the deliberate order. "This place has a pulse," she said. "You feel it as soon as you get close?" Rowan didn't argue. He poured hot water into a mug and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, savoring the heat. "I used to work search and rescue," June continued, unprompted. "Different state, different mountains." She paused, eyes on the steam rising from the mug. "A call went bad. A kid didn't make it. After that, everywhere I went felt like it was waiting for me to fail again." Rowan recognized the tone. Not self-pity, not confession. Just fact. "So I drove," she said. "North, east, wherever the road went. Heard about a cabin where people didn't disappear as often." Rowan felt the weight of that settle in him. "You found it." June nodded once. "Looks like I did." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire popping softly. Sable lay down near June's boots, close enough to be grounding, far enough not to crowd. His presence shifted the room in a way Rowan had stopped questioning. June finished her water and set the mug down. "I won't stay long," she said. "Just needed to know the story was real." Rowan watched her, then surprised himself. "You can stay the night. Storm's supposed to cycle back before morning." June hesitated, then nodded. "All right." She took a blanket from the stack and settled near the hearth, boots off, ankle wrapped carefully with practiced hands. Rowan recognized the movements of someone who knew their own injuries well. The night passed without incident. Wind rose and fell, testing the walls. The lantern burned steady. Rowan slept lightly in the loft, waking whenever Sable shifted below, but no alarms came. No urgent sounds bent the air. Morning arrived clearer than expected. The sky was pale blue, the snow glittering under early light. Rowan descended the ladder stiff and slow, his knee complaining but functional. June was already awake, sitting at the table with one of Elowen's maps spread out in front of her. "These markings," she said, tapping a shaded area near the pass. "They match something I've seen before. Not on paper, on bodies." Rowan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds bad." "It is," June said, "but it's also useful." She looked up at him. "You know what you're doing here, don't you?" Rowan glanced toward the window, where the lantern's glass still held the faint warmth of last night's flame. He thought of Tess, of Maeve, of Jonah's quiet certainty, of the box of maps waiting to be fully understood. "I'm learning," he said. June smiled at that. It wasn't a big smile, just enough to acknowledge honesty. "Good. Because if you're going to keep the light on, people are going to come. And some of them won't be as easy as a scared kid in a storm." Rowan nodded. "I know." June stood, slinging her pack over one shoulder. "I'll be back," she said, "with supplies, medical kits, a proper weather station I know how to calibrate." Rowan studied her face, then extended his hand. She took it, grip firm, unhesitating. Sable rose and walked her to the door, sitting when she stepped onto the porch. June paused, then bent and pressed her forehead briefly against the dog's. "Still noticing first," she murmured. Sable accepted the gesture with calm dignity. When June disappeared down the slope, Rowan stood in the doorway for a long moment. The cabin was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. The light on the porch mattered now. It meant something beyond him. Rowan reached up and adjusted the lantern, ensuring the wick was trimmed, the glass clean. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door, and went to the table where Elowen's maps waited. The work ahead was no longer theoretical. He stayed. Winter did not end. It softened. The days grew longer by minutes at a time, the kind of change that only mattered if you were paying attention. Snow still fell, but now it arrived without fury, drifting instead of striking. The mountain breathed in slow, patient cycles. Rowan learned the rhythm by necessity. He rose before light, fed the fire, checked the lantern, and stepped onto the porch to read the air the way others read headlines. Sable was always awake first, The Malinois had taken to patrolling the perimeter at dusk and dawn, circling the clearing with a precision that felt ceremonial. 7 years old, lean and tireless, his coat had thickened through the season, a dense underlayer built for cold nights and long waits. His ears moved constantly, tracking sounds Rowan could not yet hear. He did not bark unless it mattered. When he did, Rowan listened. The cabin changed in small ways that added up. Rowan reinforced the porch railings and salvaged a second stove from an abandoned hunting shack down the ridge, hauling it back piece by piece with his niece screaming its objections. He hung extra blankets by the door, labeled shelves with charcoal, and kept the kettle warm. Maeve returned twice with equipment, first a compact weather station she calibrated herself, then a crate of radio batteries and signal flags. She worked with efficient focus, her dark braid tucked into her jacket, her voice clipped when the wind rose. "It's not official," she said, adjusting a sensor arm. "That's the point. No paperwork, no liability arguments, just information." Rowan nodded. He liked information. June came back too. Not always staying the night, sometimes just dropping supplies and checking in. She moved carefully, the old ankle injury shaping her stride, but her hands were steady and sure. She brought medical kits, thermometers, rewarming blankets, and a small notebook filled with checklists written in a clean, slanted hand. "You don't improvise when people are cold," she said, setting the notebook on the table. "You follow steps. Feelings come later." Rowan understood that better than most. Word spread the way it always did in the mountains, quietly, by reputation rather than announcement. There was a place on the ridge, a light, a dog who noticed first. If you were lost and the wind lied to you, head east. If your compass spun, listen for the bell of the lantern. If the light was on, you were not alone. The first to test the truth of it were 2 hikers who arrived just before dusk one evening, silhouettes against the fading sky. They were college-aged, underprepared but stubborn, faces red from cold and embarrassment. One was tall and narrow-shouldered with a patchy beard that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. The other, a woman with cropped black hair and sharp eyes, leaned heavily on a trekking pole, favoring a knee twisted badly on the descent. Sable alerted long before they reached the clearing, sitting squarely by the door, posture forward, tail still. Rowan opened the door and waited. "You found it," the woman said, voice rough but steady. "We followed the light." Rowan brought them in without comment, set them near the hearth, and handed them soup. He checked the woman's knee with practiced care. His touch firm and professional. It wasn't broken. It was angry. "You'll walk on it in the morning," he said. "Not tonight." They slept on blankets by the fire, the dog positioned between them and the door like a living wall. In the morning, Rowan marked their map with charcoal, showing them where the mountain tended to cheat. They left with gratitude, heavy but quiet, the right kind. After that, it happened in ones and twos. A snowmobile rider who misjudged fuel in daylight, a trucker who took the wrong logging road and watched the world narrow too fast, a solo hiker who knew better and went anyway, shaken but alive. Rowan did not ask for names unless it mattered. He did not tell stories about what he'd done. He stayed. Jonah Pike stopped by when he could, his visits irregular but dependable. The old ranger's beard had gone nearly white now, his movements slower, but his eyes missed nothing. He brought news when there was news and silence when there wasn't. "They're calling it the Northwood Shelter," Jonah said one afternoon, leaning his weight against the table and studying the map spread across it. "Not officially, just what people say." Rowan looked up. "I didn't name it," Jonah smiled faintly. "You wouldn't." June glanced at Sable, who lay near the door, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded but present. "They also call him the dog who notices first." Sable flicked an ear, uninterested in titles. Late winter brought the hardest test. The storm came faster than forecasts predicted, a wall of white swallowing the ridge in under an hour. Maeve's voice crackled over the radio, tight with urgency. 3 hikers overdue. Trail vanished. We're losing daylight." Rowan was already pulling on his coat. Sable was already at the door. They found the first hiker clinging to a tree, disoriented but standing, tears freezing on his cheeks. The second had fallen, ankle twisted, pain spiraling into panic. The third, young, barely out of college, sat in the snow, arms wrapped around herself, convinced she was about to disappear. Sable reached her first and lay down at her side, pressing his full weight against her legs. The effect was immediate. Her breathing slowed. She stopped crying. Rowan got them all back before dark, the cabin holding more people that night than it ever had before. Bodies close, breath visible. Soup passed hand to hand. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the light stayed on. Spring did not announce itself with ceremony. Snow still fell, but now it came apologetically, melting by noon. The mountain's edges softened. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line, visible from farther down the slope. Rowan stood on the porch one morning with a mug of black coffee warming his hands, feeling watched, but not threatened. Behind him, Sable stretched across the threshold, massive paws braced, ears flicking at distant sounds. He looked older in the sunlight, the gray at his muzzle more apparent, but there was purpose in him now that went beyond commands. He was where he was meant to be. June arrived mid-morning, bringing a weather station she'd promised, and a crate of supplies she'd somehow convinced the town to donate without questions. She set the station up beside Maeve's, calibrating it with care. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, not looking at him. Rowan considered the question honestly. He thought of Lillian, and the quiet way love had slipped through his fingers, not in anger, but in absence. He thought of the note on the counter, the house that had echoed. He thought of the mountain, demanding but fair. "No," he said, "not anymore." June nodded, satisfied. She didn't push. She didn't need to. That night, long after midnight, Sable woke abruptly and let out a single sharp bark. Rowan was on his feet instantly, heart hammering, opening the door into clear air and starlight. At the edge of the clearing stood a man alone, tall and thin, wrapped in a threadbare coat, eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. "I was told the light meant I could stop running," the man said. Sable walked to him and sat. Rowan lowered his shoulders and stepped aside. "You can," he said. "Come in." The cabin received them without complaint. On the last night of winter, snow fell lightly, almost as an apology. Rowan stood on the porch beside Sable, both facing the darkening forest. The lantern behind them spilled a warm rectangle of light onto the snow, cutting a promise into the cold. "We stayed," Rowan said softly. Sable leaned into the touch of his hand, solid and present. The mountain did not answer. It didn't need to. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone would lose direction, fear would rise, the world would narrow. And then there would be a light, a dog who noticed first, and a man who did not disappear. Spring arrived the way it always did in high places, not with celebration, but with permission. The snow did not vanish, it thinned. The wind did not leave. It learned new routes. The mountain did not soften its rules. It simply loosened its grip enough to see who would stay when survival was no longer the only reason. Rowan noticed the change first in the mornings. Light came earlier, sliding through the trees in clean angles that reached the porch instead of dying halfway down the slope. The air still bit, but it no longer cut. On certain days, the smell of wet earth crept up from beneath the snowpack, a reminder that the ground had been alive all along, just waiting. Sable felt it too. The Malinois no longer patrolled with winter urgency. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if he were listening for different kinds of trouble. At 7, nearing 8, his body carried small signs of age, stiffness after long nights, the gray at his muzzle no longer hiding, but his eyes remained sharp, attentive in a way that came not from training alone, but from belonging. He still took the first watch at dusk, still positioned himself between the door and the world, but there was less tension in his shoulders. The mountain was quieter. That mattered. The cabin had changed again. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a place people expected to find standing. June Hollis had returned 3 weeks after the last heavy storm, this time not alone. She drove up in a battered utility truck, the kind with dents earned honestly, and unloaded medical supplies, spare boots, folded cots, and a compact solar panel she insisted would save arguments later. Her dark blonde hair was shorter now, cut just above the collar, easier to manage. The ankle still bothered her, but she moved with the confidence of someone who had stopped negotiating with pain. "I'm not moving in," she said, as Rowan helped her carry a crate inside. "Just staying close." Rowan accepted that without comment. Maeve came less frequently now, but when she did, she brought updates, weather trends, trail closures, quiet warnings passed along through unofficial channels. She looked lighter somehow, the permanent tension in her shoulders easing as the season turned. The mountain had taken her brother years ago. Helping people survive it did not erase that loss, but it gave it context. Purpose had a way of doing that. Jonah Pike stopped by one afternoon with a folded map and a thermos of coffee, strong enough to qualify as a controlled substance. The old ranger leaned heavily on the porch rail, his beard more white than gray now, eyes bright. "They're going to make it semi-official," he said, quietly. No signs, no press, just roots, radios, and people who know better than to talk too much. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "And liability?" Jonah smiled thinly. "We'll pretend not to see each other on paper." Sable, lying at Jonah's feet, thumped his tail once. The cabin took on a name that stuck because no one tried to force it. Northwood Shelter. Not written anywhere, just spoken. Passed from mouth to mouth, hiker to ranger, trucker to clerk. If you were lost near Glass Pass, head east. If your compass lied, follow the slope until you saw the light. If the light was on, knock once and wait. Rowan did not correct anyone. Late one afternoon, as the snow retreated from the lower trailheads, a small group arrived together, 3 volunteers Maeve had quietly vetted. They came on foot, packs heavy but well-balanced, movements careful. The first was a man in his early 30s named Caleb Ruiz, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with hands that bore the faint scars of someone who worked with machinery. He'd grown up in Colorado, lost a cousin to exposure on a backcountry trail, and carried that history in the way he scanned the terrain. The second was a woman named Erin Lockwood, mid-20s, compact and sharp-eyed, her dark hair braided tight against her head. She spoke little, observed everything, and took notes constantly. The third, older than the others, was Marcus Bell, late 40s, tall, with a salt and pepper beard and a quiet voice shaped by years as a volunteer EMT. They didn't ask to stay. They asked how to help. Rowan set them to work without ceremony, inventorying supplies, learning the maps, walking the perimeter with Sable to understand how the dog read the land. Sable tolerated the attention with patient dignity, allowing brief pats but maintaining his position near Rowan. He was not unfriendly. He was selective. That night, after the volunteers had settled into their cots and the fire had burned down to coals, Rowan sat alone at the table. The wooden box lay open in front of him, its contents arranged neatly. Only one thing remained untouched: the envelope. He opened it slowly. Alawan Mercer's handwriting filled the page, spare and unadorned. "If you're reading this, the mountain let you stay. I won't pretend I built this place out of kindness alone. I was tired of people, tired of watching them ignore warnings and blame fate, so I chose distance, silence. But even from a distance, I couldn't stop listening. This cabin was my compromise, a place that answered without speaking. I don't know what kind of man you've become. I only know the question I avoided. When others need shelter, will you stay, or will you disappear like I did?" Rowan folded the letter carefully and set it aside. He did not feel accused. He felt seen. The sound that followed was not a bark, not urgent, not sharp. Sable rose and went to the door, tail low, posture neutral. Rowan stood and joined him. Outside, the forest was calm. At the edge of the clearing stood a woman Rowan had not seen before. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, average height with a sturdy build shaped by work rather than intention. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose bun beneath a faded cap. Her jacket bore the logo of a regional power company, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. She held her hands out slightly, palms visible. "I'm not lost," she said quickly, then exhaled. "But I almost was." Her name was Hannah Price. She'd been sent to inspect a damaged relay farther down the ridge, underestimated the meltwater crossing, and watched her planned route disappear under runoff. She'd seen the light from higher ground and followed it without quite knowing why. Sable approached her, sniffed once, then sat. Approval. Hannah's shoulders sagged in relief. Good dog. Rowan smiled, just barely. She stayed for an hour, drank coffee, dried her boots, and left with directions marked clearly on her map and a radio channel scribbled in the margin. She shook Rowan's hand before she went. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." After she left, Rowan stood on the porch for a long time. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. The lantern came on automatically as dusk settled, its glow steady and familiar. June stepped out beside him, hands in her jacket pockets. "You ever think about what happens when you don't need to be here every night?" she asked. Rowan considered the question honestly. He looked at the cabin, at the maps, at the volunteers inside laughing quietly over a shared meal. He looked at Sable, who had settled near the threshold, content. "I think," Rowan said slowly, "that I'll know when that day comes." June nodded. "Fair." She hesitated, then added, "I'm thinking of staying through summer, training rotations, first aid refreshers, maybe a couple of dogs." Rowan glanced at her. "You asking?" June smiled faintly. "I am." "Yes," Rowan said. The word felt right. On the last night before the snow line retreated above the ridge for good, Rowan stood on the porch beside Sable, both of them facing the darkening forest. The lantern behind them spilled its familiar rectangle of light onto the ground. Somewhere beyond the trees, water ran fast with melt. Somewhere farther still, people moved without knowing how close they were to losing direction. Rowan rested his hand on Sable's head. "We stayed," he said again, not as a promise this time, but as a fact. Sable leaned into the touch, solid and warm. The mountain did not answer. It didn't need to. The light was on. That was enough. Sometimes God does not stop the storm. Sometimes He places someone inside it, so no one has to face the cold alone. In our own lives, we all reach moments when the road disappears, when plans fail, relationships break, or silence feels heavier than noise. And in those moments, miracles don't always arrive loudly. They arrive as a light left on, as a door that stays open, as a person who chooses not to walk away. If this story reminded you that God still works through quiet choices, ordinary people, and small acts of faith, share it with someone who may need that reminder today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what gives you strength during difficult seasons. And if stories like this bring you comfort, hope, or healing, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing them together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps through every storm. And may you always find a light waiting when the path grows dark.